Creating a new document in Photoshop is pretty straightforward. If you come up to File, choose New, you receive a number of options, and you can see our interface here. We can choose to set our width in inches and pixels, all the standard measurements. Let's say that you want to create a new document for your Facebook timeline. So we want to choose pixels. Resolution for any web-based document is 72. And then we know from looking at Facebook's recommended dimensions that the width of a timeline cover is 851 pixels. The width is 315, or excuse me, I had that backwards. The width is 851, the height is 315. The background we can leave to white. Color profile, pixel aspect ratio. The defaults in Photoshop are usually perfectly fine for 99.9% of the work that you'll do with it. So all we need to do once we have our correct dimensions inserted into our setup here is click OK. And the ending result is a panel that is to the exact dimensions that we need to create a Facebook timeline header image. If you wanted to create, say, a graphic for a new book cover, and the book cover dimensions are 6 by 9 inches, for instance, again, we would come up to File, click New. In this case, we would change our measurement ruling to inches. And because we want to create a print cover, we would actually change the resolution to 300 in this case because we're working with print. If we're creating a 6 by 9 inch cover for our book, 6 by 9 is the actual trim width, but normally we would want to allow bleed, correct? So normal bleed for a print document is 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125. So typically you'll want to allow 0.125 times 2 for both the width and the height. So what that means is we would want to create a document with a width of not 6 inches, but 6.25 to allow for the bleed for our cover. We would want to create the document height as 9.25 to allow for the bleed top and bottom. And once we have that set, we can click OK. Working with your own files in Photoshop is very straightforward. To open an existing document or photograph, you simply come up to File, choose Open. You want to find the folder that contains the file that you want to work with. In this case, I already have a folder open called PS Docs. I'm going to select this photo right here, the sunset, and choose Open. And it opens the file in Photoshop. Now, you can open multiple files when you're importing existing documents into Photoshop. You can just simply choose File, Open, and then holding the Control or the Command key down, depending on whether you're on a PC or a Mac, you can select multiple files. So I could select this sunset and this cartoon character here, choose Open, and you'll notice that the files were opened in Photoshop in their own tab. So each one is isolated and you can work on them independently or combine them, and we're going to look at how to do that in an upcoming video. Another important part of the document management process in Photoshop is, of course, saving your document. And you have the option to both save and save as, like you do on most programs. And to access that option, you simply click File and choose Save. If you want to save over top of the existing file If you've made changes, it's likely that you'll want to actually choose Save As. And so whenever I choose Save As, it brings up the original file name and the fact that it was a JPEG image. It gives me the option of where to save the document. I could save it in its original folder or choose a new folder to save it into. And then the format. And there's a number of formats that are available in Photoshop, some of which you'll use on a very regular basis. Others you may never use at all. Okay, the most common ones are the native Photoshop format, which is the PSD format, and that's extremely important to use if you're making any kind of changes in Photoshop that include layers and paths and those kinds of things that you may want to go back and edit later. If you're done with your work and you've already saved a Photoshop version of your work, you may want to then select one of the other options depending on what its final use is. If you're going to be using your document for the web, then JPEG or PNG would be the best options for you to use. If you're saving your document for print, whether it's a book cover or perhaps it's graphics for a brochure, you're going to be using it to further create a document using a layout program like Adobe InDesign, then your choice may want to be TIFF, the TIFF file format, which is a PostScript file format that is fully compatible with image setters that you would use for printing commercially. And then finally, I want to highlight the Photoshop PDF format, which is based on the Adobe Acrobat file format. And by using Photoshop PSD, it has some unique features with it being used in Photoshop. For instance, it does have the ability to maintain layers. You can also convert the layers into separate pages within the PDF. Okay, so that is an option for us as well. And as a matter of fact, if we choose that option here, now we only have a single layer, but I can choose to save this as a PDF, and then I click Save. It brings up a warning which you can turn off, and I'll click OK, and it brings up the standard Adobe PDF presets, high quality, press quality, smallest file size, and so on. And I'm going to go with the default high quality print. If you want to preserve Photoshop editing capabilities, like if our document had layers and you wanted to maintain that, you would make sure that this checkbox was checked. If you want to optimize it for fast web, which is a default, and usually I leave that checked as well, you can do that. If you want to view the PDF after saving it, you would check this box, and what will happen is whenever you click Save PDF, it will launch Adobe Acrobat if you have that installed and give you the opportunity to view the PDF and how it appears. With compression, typically, in most cases, the default settings are what you're always going to use. The same with output. The default usually makes sense. You don't need to embed color models or anything like that. Very often, you can require a password if it's a sensitive document. You would just simply check that and then enter a password here. You can also restrict printing, editing, and so on if you want to do that. And then the summary is basically just the choices that you've made for the setup. Okay, so once you've selected all of these options, you'd simply choose Save PDF. And we're going to say yes in this particular case. And it tells you that if you preserve Photoshop editing capabilities, it's incompatible with earlier versions of Photoshop. So since we're using the latest version of Photoshop, I'm just going to move forward with yes. And you'll notice here it says saving 10%. So it'll actually tell me how far along it is in the saving process. You can also see that down here at the bottom of the screen where it says saving 10%. And then it's done. And so now our document is actually a PDF, and we have the original JPEG version as well. If I wanted to change the document and save it as a PNG, let's just select PNG, and I choose Save. It's going to give me separate options. One is related to compression. If I want no compression and make the document open fast, I would choose that. The default is to choose smallest. In other words, to make the PNG file the smallest that it can be, and it takes longer to do that. Okay, normally with interlace you would select none. I can click OK, and my PNG version is saved. If I was saving this document for print and I was choosing the TIFF option, click Save, and it gives me several choices here. One for compression. I normally use LZW and none of the others. With pixel order, the default is typically fine, interleaved. Byte order, it depends on whether you're using a PC or a Mac. I'm on a Mac, so I would choose that. The other options here, you probably will never use. So you just click OK, and you're done. Let's say that the existing document that you're working with needs to be sized to a different resolution than what the current size is. Simply click Image, Image Size, and it'll show you what the current resolution is. You'll notice that the current size here is 75.958 inches by 50.625 at a resolution of 72. And that's pretty large. Let's say that we actually want to use this photograph for a Facebook timeline header, and we definitely need to scale it down. So first thing we're going to do is change the dimensions from inches to pixels, and you can see what our pixel width and height is. And you'll remember from a previous video that the dimensions for the Facebook timeline cover is 851, and you'll notice that automatically it sizes the image to a height of 567, which is actually higher than what our height needs to be for our final version. And if we wanted to actually adjust the image to the literal pixels here, you'll notice we have this little chain. If I click on that and turn it off, then I can rescale the height independently of the width. If I have it selected, everything scales dynamically, keeping the photograph, in this case, in direct proportion. So if I choose 851 and click OK, it'll scale the image down to the actual size, and then we can crop it to get to our final dimension height of 315 pixels. Now you also notice that the image has gotten a lot smaller on the screen, and so the easiest way to zoom in on the image, you have two options. One is to actually come over to the toolbar and click on the zoom and just click zooming it in until you get it to the size that you want to work with, which this is actually at 100% right here. The other option is, if you're on a PC, you can use Control plus and minus. If you're on a Mac, you can use Command plus or minus. And by choosing those options, it also allows you to zoom in or out. Now, along with the scaling, we also have an option. You'll notice from before we imported other images and they're in tab form. And let's say that we want to take this image of Dexter and combine it with our sunset picture here. The easiest way to do that in this newer version of Photoshop is to click our Move tool, left mouse click and drag this character onto the tab where we want him to go, and then release it. And it instantly moves him from the tab that he was on, which he's still there, it's just a copy, but it moves it and places it into our image here. Now, an alternative way of doing that is to copy and paste, and I'll show you how to do that as well. But before I do, I want to point out that you'll notice that whenever I moved him into this document, that over here in the layers palette, he is actually now on his own layer, and the original is still here as the background file, and Dexter was added to a layer above him, and that happens by default. Okay, so it works very seamlessly. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you can also copy and paste. You can use the keystroke command of Control or Command A to select all, then Control or Command C to copy, and then come over to your document and use Control or Command V to paste. And you get the same end result, except that whenever the new file is pasted, it's pasted centered, as you can see here. If I turn off the original one that we had dragged over into our document, you'll notice that whenever I pasted it absolutely centered. Now, you actually, whenever you're pasting an image into an existing document, you can actually control where its positioning will paste into using a little trick. And I'll just show you this trick since we're talking about this. If you choose the rectangular marquee tool, and let me actually delete this guy here. I'm just going to click the trash can. And so that'll delete the layer. Yes, I want to delete. Now, I'm going to, with the rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to draw just a little box. It doesn't have to be any particular size. I'm just going to put it down here in the lower left-hand corner. And so this selection is here. There's nothing in it. You notice that there's no new layers or anything like that. But what happens is that now whenever I choose Paste, Control V, or you can access Copy and Paste from the Edit menu, you'll see Copy and Paste are right here. Okay, but when I hit Control or Command V now, what will happen is the rectangular marquee selection will control where the image will paste. Watch. So now the image pastes centered on the selection that I had selected, and of course the selection that was made vanishes whenever the document pastes, and it also still pastes it into its own layer. So you can actually have some control over where your document pastes if you need that control, but by default it will paste to the absolute center of the existing image that you're pasting into. An additional file saving option that you have in Photoshop, if you are wanting to save files specifically for the web, is the Save for Web option. And you'll notice here in this image that I have on the screen, we have a picture of Dexter, cartoon character, and I've removed the background that was in this illustration, and so it's currently transparent. And perhaps you want to save this image for the web but maintain the transparency that exists there. So Photoshop gives you a number of options in order to actually save for the web. Let's just go to File, Save for Web, and take a look at the options that we have. So here is our file, and you'll notice over here on the right there's a number of presets. One is, normally the default is PNG24, and that is the preset that we would typically use to maintain the transparency of the document. And you can see they actually have a checkbox that allows us to make sure that that transparency is maintained. If I were to set this to JPEG, which is another web-based file format, say JPEG High, you'll notice how it removes the transparency, because the JPEG file format doesn't maintain transparency at all. It isn't created as a file format in order to do that, but we can adjust the quality here with a slider depending on how high or how low a quality our JPEG needs to be. There's also presets, JPEG High, Low, and Medium. Another option that we have here is to save our file format in the GIF file format, and this can come in handy if you're created animated GIFs where each layer is another frame in the animation. And so in that case you would select one of these, like say GIF 128 dithered, and you'll notice that it does maintain transparency. We do have that option here, and you have control over how many colors are rendered, and you can see the color table listed here. Okay, so you know exactly what is going to be saved from a document and information perspective if you're saving it in this file format. Okay, so in this case, we're going to select PNG 24, and we want to maintain the transparency. There is no color table because it's saving it in the full 24-bit file format, which means we're getting all of the data that we need. And by the way, you'll notice down here in the left-hand corner, it actually tells you the final file size. So in the PNG 24 file format, the final file will be around 84.82 kilobytes. Okay, if I were to switch that over to say JPEG High, you notice that it actually is much smaller, 19.8. If I chose say GIF 128 dithered, it's 22K. So PNG is definitely a larger file format because you're preserving more color data without compression. And that's really a big point that we want to make here. So once you choose the web file format that you want to use, in this case we're going to use PNG 24, simply click Done. And that's it. It automatically saved it to the folder where I had chosen.